The living room was so stinky that no one could get in at all. A few 1 to 20 emergency doctors immediately turned around and vomited. 5 people vomited and have diarrhea. This kind of smell is really very disheartening. But there was no way. It was important to save people. They still resisted the disgusting smell and rescued the 5 incontinent Wilson family from the villa. The medical staff hurriedly rushed the Wilson family to an ambulance and took them to Oris Hill People's Hospital. After a gastric lavage and infusion, the Wilson family finally got some relief and temporarily recovered and was arranged to continue the infusion in the emergency ward. The old Mrs. Wilson and Haraya's beds were next to each other, and Noah and others were in the innermost. At this time, everyone had an earthy face, a sickly look, and they couldn't beat any energy at all. A doctor wearing a mask came in and asked, "What did your family eat at night? We initially suspected that you should be food poisoned, so you have to think carefully about what you have eaten. We can also determine the scope. Reduce it a bit. If you can't find it's because of some poison, then we can't prescribe the right medicine." Old Mrs. Wilson couldn't help muttering, "Our family didn't eat anything else at night, just a meal of dumplings. Mom, there is definitely something wrong with this dumpling. Otherwise, we won't all be food poisoned." Haraya couldn't help but complain to Mrs. Wilson. She knew that this was the case. What kind of dumpling she would eat with her? Isn't this asking for trouble? Mrs. Wilson also felt that there was a problem with the dumplings at this time, but there seemed to be no problem in every aspect, so logically speaking, there should be no food poisoning. Thinking of this, the old Mrs. Wilson said, "We made the dumplings by ourselves. There is no problem of deterioration. What could go wrong?" Harold on the side said bitterly, "Grandma, I heard that many unscrupulous merchants use poor quality pork as a good buy. Is there a problem with pork?" "Pork? Then you have to ask where your mother bought it." Old Mrs. Wilson frowned and looked at Haraya and asked, "Did you go to the Black Mall to buy water-infused pork?" Haraya hurriedly shook her head. "It's impossible. I watched the vendor cut the pork from the half fan. There is absolutely no problem." When Wendy heard this, she said weakly, "What about that noodle? Were the dumpling noodles right?" Haraya shook her head again. "The noodles are fine. I had eaten it a long time ago. The noodles are okay, and the pork is okay." Could it be that the problem lies with the leaks? Thinking of this, Haraya couldn't help but open her mouth. "There must be something wrong with the leaks. Maybe there are pesticide residues." Old Mrs. Wilson frowned and said, "The freshly cut fresh leeks can't be a problem, and the sea dragon has also been washed. Even if there are pesticide residues, they are all washed." Harold said, "I take the washing seriously." I stroked and did the washing one by one. The Wilson family repeated each sentence several times, and no one could tell why, so they could only observe. The doctor said helplessly, "If you can't figure out what it is, you can only temporarily wrong you for a while. We will send your blood and secretions to the testing department for testing. If the test results come out, then I can know what poisoning it is." Old Mrs. Wilson nodded weakly and said, "Then you should have a test quickly." After waiting for about an hour, the doctor came over, still holding a few test sheets. As soon as he entered the door, the doctor said to everyone, "Your test report came out. All 5 of you are daffodil poisoned, and the poisoning dose is quite large." "What's the matter? Are you growing a lot of daffodils in your family garden?" Hearing this, the old Mrs. Wilson was stunned, frowning, and asked, "Daffodine poisoning? What is that?" The medical staff said lightly, "Daffodils are a kind of plant, which is often used as a flower for decoration. When it is not in bloom, it looks like a leek. Many people eat it by mistake every year." With that said, the medical staff took out their mobile phones, searched for pictures of daffodils, and handed them to Mrs. Wilson. "Here, this is it." Old Mrs. Wilson saw the picture of the daffodils. Her face turned green, and she trembled and said, Isn't this the new leeks grown by the Charlie family today? This thing turned out to be a daffodil." Speaking of this, the old Mrs. Wilson could not wait to look up to the sky and curse. "Charlie, you are so poisonous. How can there be a devil like you in the world?" The doctor asked in surprise, "What's the situation? Has anyone poisoned you? If someone poisons you, you should call the police." Harold immediately cursed angrily. "Grandma calls the police. Call the police now. Call the police to catch evil Charlie Day." Old Mrs. Wilson was also mad and immediately took out her cell phone, pressed 1 to 10 tremblingly, and then dialed. After the call was connected, the operator immediately asked, "Hello, alarm center. What problem do you encounter and need to call the police?" Old Mrs. Wilson said immediately, "Comrade Police, our family of 5 has been poisoned, and it is poisoned by someone. You must help us uphold justice and catch the bastard." When the operator heard this, he immediately became nervous and blurted out, "What's the situation? Can you tell us in detail?" Mrs. Wilson said, "There is a bastard named Charlie who lives in Thompson Villa A05. This bastard grows daffodils at home to pretend to be leeks. I cut off his family's daffodils in the afternoon and went home to make dumplings. After eating, our family was poisoned. We are now lying in the hospital. You must be fair for us.